So thank you if you've been polite enough to listen through my last video. This is just a continuation of my thoughts on feminism and why I take issue with it. I'm not going to go through all the disclaimers I made in the first video because it's just going to take up time. So to continue directly, the last point I made was that feminism ignores men's issues. It basically stands in the way of men's issues, and that's something that feminists will deny. But by constantly promoting the myth of male privilege, or at the very least the distortion of male privilege, that is exactly what feminism is doing. Because what feminism and feminists constantly do is send out the illusion that men are princes of privilege and women are victims, and in doing so they then make it almost impossible for men's issues to be raised. Because when men's issues are raised, I've even heard feminists say that, for example, men, or anyone for that matter, who tries to raise the issue of male victims of domestic violence have an agenda because they are really abusive husbands or boyfriends. So that proves that feminism really does not give any platform whatsoever to men's rights. I would like an example within the feminist movement, a single example of a men's issue being given a platform, if this is truly an egalitarian movement, but it's not. Look at the word feminism. It is a gender-centric movement. At the very least, feminists should be honest about that. It's not an egalitarian movement, it's a gender-centric movement, because a truly egalitarian movement would look at issues impacting both men and women. Sure, discuss women's issues, but give a platform to men's issues as well, and it doesn't do that. But what's worse than doing that, it would be bad enough if it just ignored men's issues, but there are feminists who actively try to silence men. And I know full well that many moderate feminists will say, oh, but that's not true, we don't deny men's issues. Okay, but you don't do anything at all to condemn those who do. And that is a very big part of the problem. By the way, I should say at this stage, although I'm making points, a lot of these points sort of cross over and run into one another. And this is an example. So, feminism does promote the distortion of male privilege. This is one of the issues I really take with feminism. This constant, well, frankly, it's a lie that historically men have always been privileged. If you look at many, many, many areas, it is overwhelmingly men who are victims. If you look at war, men are overwhelmingly the victims of combat, especially throughout history. If you look at dangerous occupations, men are overwhelmingly the victims. If you look at suicide, men are overwhelmingly, well, maybe not overwhelmingly for that one, because it's a little bit more 50-50, but nevertheless, it is more men than women who go through with committing suicide. Homelessness, though, it's a majority of men who are homeless. There's many, many areas. None of these issues gets any attention because, and this is a point I'll come to, of feminist influence in the media. None of those issues get sufficient attention. The issues themselves may get attention, i.e. homelessness, but not the fact that it is something that impacts one gender more than the other, because it does. So just like when we talk about soldiers who are serving on the front line, now this is no disrespect to women who are serving on the front line, I know they do, but nevertheless it is overwhelmingly men. And therefore, by extension, it is overwhelmingly men who are victims of frontline combat. That's just a fact. I'm not saying that civilians don't suffer in war, of course they do, but I'm talking about, for example, when we think of the United States Armed Forces, when we think of the British Armed Forces and so on, the vast majority of fatalities of war are men. When we think about a military's perspective, civilians is a different matter when you look at places like Syria. But what I'm trying to get at here is overwhelmingly it is male victims, and yet that issue doesn't seem to really be recognised. Because we live in such a politically correct age whereby everything has to be seen as gender neutral but in favour of women. So there's definitely distortion going on here, and I think it is a deep insult actually to the millions, literally millions of men who were killed and wounded, especially in the First World War, also the Second World War. But I say especially the First World War because in the First World War they were shamed if they didn't go to the front. I've covered the white feather issue. This is something that to me is absolutely rubbing salt in the wound of male sacrifice. Male sacrifice is a real issue throughout history, not male privilege, male sacrifice, because it's always been the responsibility and it has always fallen on the shoulders of men to sacrifice for their countries, more often than not to protect women. And that fact does not get acknowledged at all by the feminist movement. So this distortion about male privilege is poisonous, and I think it is one of the most shameful aspects of modern feminism, that they continue to promote that lie about male privilege. I mean, what they focus on for this argument about male privilege is the fact that when you have governments, cabinets tend to be made up by men. But that disregards the fact that the people at the bottom of society, the homeless, are overwhelmingly men as well. So feminists obsess about women at the top whilst ignoring men at the bottom. That's the fundamental issue here. Also, the point I would make about government is the vast majority of people will never be in that position of power. So yes, it might be a majority men, but it's a very, very small select group of men. And for the record, there are more female executives at the BBC right now than men, or at least there is, put it this way, there's at least 4 female executives at the BBC who make more money than the Prime Minister, and yet feminists have an obsession about women at the top, whilst ignoring men at the bottom. So the myth of male privilege is one of the biggest, and I think most shameful problems with modern feminism. Now, the next point is very important. The reluctance of moderates to confront misandry within the movement. I made it clear at the start of the last video that I don't believe that all feminists hate men. I think that's a slightly immature caricature, and I think anti-feminists make the mistake of falling into that trap of coming out with that sort of caricature. Oh, all feminists are man-haters. I don't believe that for a second. As I say, many feminists counter, oh, we have brothers, we have fathers, we have husbands, we don't hate them. So no, I don't believe that all feminists hate men. I believe some certainly do. And I believe the problem is, when you have a movement whereby the moderates within the movement, by which I mean feminists who don't hate men, when they refuse to do anything, or when they turn a blind eye to the problem, or when they make excuses, then the movement delegitimizes itself. Now what I mean by that is, many feminists will constantly counter, we don't hate men, we are all about equality, we only support women's rights, we don't oppose men's rights. This is the usual sort of excuses that will be made. But I am yet to see a reasonable feminist, a moderate feminist, actually speak out against the misandry that is within the movement. Whenever the extremists within the movement historically are quoted, people like Marilyn French and Germaine Greer and Andrea Dworkin, and some of the extreme, hateful, genocidal comments they have come out with, quite often the excuses are, oh, they're just tongue-in-cheek comments, they don't mean that. Or they're fringe figures, they're not very important. Except the problem is they're not fringe figures. These women are very often best-selling authors. Very often they are quoted within feminist circles all the time. Many feminists hold them in very high regard. They are not fringe figures at all. Just because the average feminist doesn't necessarily use the same language does not mean that they are fringe figures. And when moderate feminists ignore them, that is a very serious problem. Because if the moderates aren't going to stand up to the problem, then the extremists will basically get the threshold of the movement, and that is what is happening. I mean, Emma Watson's speech, much quoted speech, is not going to do anything to change decades of stirring up hostility against men. The next issue I want to raise is the disproportionate influence on the media. This is another very important aspect. And for this I want to quote some polls that have been done relatively recently. These were the most recent polls I could find on the issue, but it's relatively up to date. It's from 2013. And this was an Economist YouGov poll. In that poll, it doesn't say if it's the UK or the US. The Economist is a British, well, these are both British sources, so I assume that's the UK. It says that 72% of respondents, 72%, said they do not consider themselves feminists. That was only 18% of men, and okay, more women, 38%, but still a minority of women, and that's very significant. So, a minority of people identify themselves as feminists. Therefore, it is indisputable that the term has negative connotations. Now, if you go into a street and say to someone, do you believe in equality between men and women? I believe 80-90% of people would say, yeah, sure. If you go into a street and say, do you call yourself a feminist? I believe a majority of people would say, no, I don't. Now, there is a reason for that. Feminists will say, oh, the dictionary definition is da-da-da. But the movement undeniably has a negative image, and even many feminists have come to accept that. They do acknowledge it, and they say, but why? We just believe in equality. Well, if you really, really don't know the reason, I would say at best you're a little bit naive, if you really cannot see why feminism has the negative image it has. And this is a source from Cosmopolitan magazine. It goes on to say, celebrities also routinely reject the term. Taylor Swift isn't a feminist, but she doesn't think about things as guys versus girls, although I think recently she came out and said that she was. Lady Gaga isn't one because she loves men. Sarah Jessica Parker is a humanist. Carrie Underwood thinks the word can come off as a negative connotation. Shailene Woodley also loves men and believes in sisterhood more than feminism. And Katy Perry says, I'm not a feminist, but I believe in the strength of women. And then the magazine goes on to patronisingly say these women don't understand feminism. But undeniably, feminism has negative connotations. I think any honest feminist would admit that. And moderate feminists try to go out of the way to counter this negative connotation. Although in my view, until they start to stand up against the misandry within the movement, then they're going to have a job on their hands. I mean, one point I'd like to make here: if feminism is really so tolerant and so up for freedom of expression for women especially, then it would not feel the need to try to pressure people into agreeing with it. If it really believes that women can decide for themselves their own destiny, then by its own definition, it should respect the right of women to not call themselves feminists. But no, many feminists patronize those women and say they don't really understand the term. So that's just a bit of double standards, which is something that feminism has expertise in. And there's other polls sort of testifying to that. So, a majority of people do not identify themselves as feminists. Why, therefore, does a very large bulk of the media seem to constantly pander to feminism? Why is it the United Nations gives huge credence to this? Now, okay, in the UN, I can allow a little bit more flexibility because, like I said, there's parts of the world where specific women's rights movements are needed. But I would be a lot more inclined to believe, say, a woman who had been a victim of an acid attack speaking at the UN rather than a privileged Western celebrity like Emma Watson. I think that would have a lot more credibility. I still believe that Emma Watson, whilst she herself might have some good intentions, I still believe that either she's being used as a pawn or she's being disingenuous. I believe this is just a feminist stunt to try and give itself some legitimacy by trying its level best to pull men in, by saying, oh please men, come and be subservient to this movement. Let's face it, that's what he or she is all about. So I'm going off on a tangent here, but I want to make this point. Someone had a good memo, I forget who it was, but it said, after years of saying we don't need men, he for she is now all about feminists playing the damsel in distress. That's actually a pretty good point, because feminism for years has preached about strong independent women, and now it's saying that they need men. So that's just disingenuous. So why is it that feminism and feminists get such a platform in the media when they do not? That is clearly disproportionate when you consider that most people clearly do not support feminism. And it's no good saying, oh, but people support the dictionary definition of feminism. No, people support the definition of equality. It's not the same thing at all. Right, unfortunately I'm going to have to go into a third video, but please bear with me. I am coming near the end now. Unfortunately my bandwidth has changed, so I simply can't go longer than 15.5 minutes.